When we talk about influencing, ultimately, it is about communication. Some people think communication is just sending stuff out into the ether rather than, is your message being received? Is anyone actually listening to what you have to say? There is a need to be clear on what your position is and what you stand for and why you're advocating for a particular position. That absolutely is the start of the process. I can't think of anything that doesn't involve some compromise and some middle ground. When we're talking about change, that does mean some disruption. You don't get change without some kind of push, as well as the consensus building and problem solving. So if you're going to advocate for change, you have to be sort of strong and confident that you have a legitimate reason for advocating for that. And then that you have to do it by listening and circling back. And that goes internally within organizations of large numbers of people through to smaller numbers. It's always the same thing, particularly if you're leading an organization. You do have to have a vision and a sense of direction. People need that. Not everyone will be on board with that or understand it. That's the majority of the work. Just understanding that's the job, is to communicate and be open. I think you just got to be open at all times to hearing what people have to say.
Have you ever noticed that some of the best ideas come from unexpected places? Your next breakthrough may come from a leader facing similar challenges, but in a completely different sector. Welcome to Chief Influencer. I'm your host, Anthony Shop. Join us as we explore how today's successful leaders inspire, influence, and connect with others. Chief Influencer is a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board, who have teamed up to spotlight how great leaders and communicators are making their impact in the world. This episode is brought to you by the George Washington University's College of Professional Studies. With in-person and online programs ranging from master's degrees in public relations strategy to certificate programs in digital communications, GW offers more than just the credentials to help working professionals get ahead. It prepares them to be leaders in their field. As a proud GW graduate myself, I can attest that faculty members combine academic rigor with real-world lessons that can't always be found in textbooks. Check out cps.gwu.edu for more information. I am thrilled to introduce today's guest, Graham Davies. He's the president and CEO of DiMA, the Digital Media Association, where he represents the world's leading streaming services and advocates to ensure they can continue to innovate to provide unparalleled access to music and revolutionize the way music fans and artists connect. Here are 3 things that I think you should know about Graham. Number 1, Graham served as CEO of the Ivors Academy, where he led influential campaigns and gave evidence to the UK Culture, Media, and Sports Select Committee inquiry that called for a complete reset of streaming. Number 2, he is committed to increasing equality, diversity, and inclusion in the music industry and has launched a series of groundbreaking initiatives, including the Word from the Ivors Academy Diploma in Creative Entrepreneurship, Advocacy Accelerator, and Pay Gap Reporting. And number 3, a musician himself and a music industry veteran, Graham has held senior positions at PRS for Music and played active parts on industry boards with UK Music, the Council of Music Makers, and the British Copyright Council. Graham, across the pond, you've been called a groundbreaker and an innovator. Now that you're here in the States, we can call you a chief influencer. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Anthony. It's a real privilege, delight to be here and speak with you.
Well, we're really excited to speak with you and dive in. I was, thinking about, obviously streaming is something that I don't know anybody who doesn't take advantage of. It's totally changed our relationship with music. And I wondered, maybe just to start though, I'd love to ask, why did you decide to leave the comfort of home in the UK to move over here to Washington, DC?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a great question. And I've been here just a bit over 5 months now and absolutely loving being based in DC. My previous home for nigh on 30 years was London. So you're right, I was very fortunate to have created a great life in London. I have an amazing family, friends. It was all, very well established. And also, many would argue one of the best jobs in the music industry. The Ivors Academy represents songwriters and composers. They do an absolutely essential and sometimes overlooked role. Music doesn't exist without the songwriters and composers. That's the start of the process. Every recording has a song in it, and sometimes people overlook that fact. So it really was for me, a fantastic thing to be able to work with that community of people. And the Ivors Academy also presents arguably the most important awards in the world for songwriting. They're incredibly well respected. So fantastic job. I had been in that job for 5 years and had a lot of pride about the things that we had achieved there, really sort of turned around the organization and moved it to a more international perspective, and achieved so much. But that probably lies in the sort of the desire to kind of move on and take on another challenge. And for me, that comes from, I think, the nature of what perhaps excites me, which is being able to develop things and problem solve, and find a strategy, develop a strategy, and bring it forward. So that's the nature of, I think, the kind of CEO that I am. And the roles that I had prior to being a CEO were very much in strategy development and change. So change has always been really a constant for me. But also, to be completely honest, one of the main drivers was I've learned a lot. I feel like I know what I have to offer, but I know I've got a lot more to learn, and to develop, both in the music industry, which is my career, industry, but also just as a person, and had got to that point of always thinking, wouldn't it be great to have the experience of living and working in another country? I had a brief stint as a consultant working to the American Society of Composers and Authors and Publishers, ASCAP, in New York. I did that for a year. I was commuting, and so really loved that experience, but wanted to really see what it's like to inhabit another culture, which you really, I think, get if you dive in. So that's exactly that's the rationale for why I'm here, and I'm pleased to say that I think it's working out very, very well. From me, sort of professionally, this is a fantastic opportunity. I mean, the chance to sort of move to a different part of the industry, bringing everything I have, but really, going in deep into the services. Just as you say, streaming is now powering the music industry. It's that interface with consumers and fans. So working with some of the most successful organizations in the world is an amazing opportunity. And being based in DC, and we'll come on to it, but giving testimony to the Senate subcommittee on IP this week is what a privilege. So I'm very fortunate to have had this opportunity, and feel quite humble to be here.
Yeah, I was thinking, less than a year, and you're already testifying before Congress. So baptism by fire here in DC for sure. You said you like navigating change, as a CEO. So you've obviously picked a good industry for that. I was looking at DiMA represents some companies that, a few of us may have heard of before. Amazon, Apple Music, Feed.fm, Pandora, Spotify, YouTube. And, what's kind of interesting, obviously these are really influential companies, but not too long ago, they were all startups that were, and go back a little bit before that, and nobody had heard of them, and they didn't even exist yet. So it just shows you how much change there has been in our lives and in the music industry. But I wondered if you could just talk about, why did all these companies decide to team up and work together? Why was DiMA needed?
Yeah, I think your intro to that is really, really good, because my background in my career has come from music publishing, so songwriters, but also publishers. And music publishing is, I should know the exact time, over 100 years old. Well over 100 years. I mean, some of the classical publishers will be a couple of 100 years old. So as an industry, that very well established, and the publishers coming together and the songwriters coming together. There's lots of infrastructure in the industry of how people come together and align on their positions and advocate for their best interests. The streaming industry, or the music streaming industry, is, as you say, we probably feel like it's been here for a long time. It's not hugely long, and then it's still growing and it's still establishing. But that said, DiMA has actually existed for about a quarter of a century. So there has been this construct here, and actually the membership of DiMA has changed from 25 years ago to now. And just to your point, because the nature of digital, the digital revolution and how we access content and how we access music has shifted really enormously. And for the music industry, it's always seen these technological changes from vinyl to CD and radio, pirate radio. All these things are, the music industry always keeps pace and is often at the forefront of technological change. And so, in terms of DiMA and its members, we have the leading streaming services within our membership. We actually work through another construct which exists, and DiMA supports this, which is actually with a wider number of streaming services, which of all different types and sizes. So really, I think that it's that we sort of operate best as an industry where we have the opportunity to kind of align and work together. So that's the case for the DiMA's members. They get more from this opportunity within DiMA to come together and understand what are the common challenges. And there are lots of challenges that the services face in the music supply chain in particular. It's very complex. There are a number of data and operational and licensing issues there, which are being worked on before we get to other innovations and change. The hearing that I was speaking to this week was on the draft of a No Fakes Act, which talks to digital replicas coming from AI technology. So that brings a whole load of further challenges for the whole industry. And so we're a point here where we can be an interface for the members with what is a very broad industry, from record labels and artists to music publishers and songwriters and all those involved in the back end side of making the industry work.
When I think about the different stakeholders that you're talking about, because musicians and songwriters and policymakers, I know you're a musician yourself, right? You're a classically trained musician. Does that help you do your job and connect with those stakeholders?
I hope so. I think that it always, for me, it's been one of those, you always try to work in something that you have a passion and a love for. And so my whole career has been in music, and my whole sort of training and upbringing was similarly so. I think it helps in relation to my previous role at the Davies Academy. I think I was able to bring my experience of how the industry works and the kind of the operational and strategic side to working with songwriters whose day-to-day life is absolutely not in that space. It's in the creative space. And so I think my time there was successful because I was able to empathize and connect and communicate and have an understanding of the different priorities that exist. And so I think very much bringing this now into the work with the streaming services, they absolutely want the very best music to come through and connect with fans. Our members are at the sort of the intersect here between yourself, Andy. I don't know what your style of music. I don't know if I can pull you across there in terms of what genre of music you like, but you're using your music streaming service, and because you love music and you're a fan of music, but that's where the artists and the songwriters sit, right? This kind of interface. So the services, absolutely want to have a strong relationship with the industry because that's what we need for the consumers, and the consumers need to have a strong relationship with, you know, the music creators. So I'm hoping that you know, we'll come on to, I suppose, sort of leadership styles and things like that. You know, I am I think, you know, very sort of collaborative and open, and coming from a musician background is hopefully helpful.
I mean, do you find yourself at these industry parties where you play piano, right? Am I remembering that right? Where you're pressured to play the piano, and I mean that might be intimidating. What's your go-to? What do you play when you have to do that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think sort of often it will be, I don't know, Elton John, or I've got some kind of honky tonk. You know, ragtime is always, you know, I'm thinking, you know, a soft landing for most people.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. But I have to admit, I'm a bit rusty.
I play a little piano, but I basically just try to keep up like 3 songs that
Yeah, exactly.
I was 16. So it's a lot of work to do that, but I don't find myself with, you know, full-time musicians like you do. I think I would just say no, I don't play anything.
My go-to response is no.
Okay. But it's good. It's humbling to show them that, you know, you understand what they do.
But you know, in those settings, it's incredibly daunting, and you know, leave it to the professionals, which I am not. But you know, playing actually is awesome, and whatever level you are, and you know, it's, for me, it's important to have that outlet. I've always had the ability to play, you know, socially, and played in bands and things like that, and I you know, everyone enjoys it, right? I mean, if you're enjoying it, other people enjoy it, as long as you're not making a complete mess of it.
Right, exactly. And people are polite even when we do. Okay, so we're talking a lot about streaming, and we all know streaming as consumers. I mean, of course, like this is how we consume music and get access to all our favorite stuff and new stuff these days. But what do we need to know about streaming from a public policy perspective? Because I'm sure most people, they just don't ever think about that. They pull out their phone and they, you know, just can instantly play whatever they want, and they're not thinking about all the inner workings of what's happening, and, you know, testimony in front of Congress and laws and all that stuff. So what do we need to know about public policy as it relates to streaming?
So I think that there has been perhaps a sort of misunderstanding of what role the streaming services actually play, and how it works. So I think that what I found in the UK, and we had a very strong narrative in the UK, which in my past role we kind of kicked up, and that kicked up at the point of the pandemic. So you had artists and musicians and songwriters sat at home like everybody was, but you know, they were unable to go to a studio, they were unable to play live, and so suddenly we're looking to their streaming income as well as other income sources. But streaming now is, you know, 80+% of the recorded music revenues, so very, very substantial. And looking, okay, well, how much money am I getting through from streaming, and is it enough, and can it sustain me without these other forms of income? So I think that one of the challenges we've had is that, you know, there's streaming needs to pay more. Okay, great, but actually the streaming services do not pay the artists and the songwriters directly. The streaming services pay their representatives, which would be labels and publishers and performing right organizations. So I think one of the things that we've needed to do now, educating policymakers, is that if you were to compare how much a streaming service like Spotify is paying of the money they collect from the consumer into the industry, you know, that's over 2/3, you know, between, you know, 2/3 and 70%. If you compare that to how much a broadcaster of like a radio station is paying the rights industry from their take, it's less than 10%. So actually streaming, you know, it's still evolving, but it's actually, you know, got a very strong track record here of paying in a lot to the industry from what the consumer's paying through. But there needs to be that margin, I think that the services are taking is paying for an awful lot of activity and, heavy lifting in terms of the technology, the engagement with the consumers and all of that. So that I think just understanding the economics is something that we found is quite difficult it's been quite difficult to get it across. And there's been a fair amount of tension. So we're quite keen to just bring forward the facts and talk about, how it works. I think, we've seen, should the consumer pay more for their music as just subscription, that we all, in terms of streaming, use the video services and all of that as well. So I think what we've seen is actually, the backdrop here was that it's only 15, 20 years ago that people were not paying for music streaming. It was very much a piracy environment. So I think one of the massive successes is that we do now have a very strong engagement of people with their music streaming subscriptions. We do bits of research. We did a piece of research in Canada recently, and like 1 or 2% of the respondents were not happy with their streaming service. This is extraordinary levels of engagement, so it's very, very positive. But you've got to be careful in terms of what the price is, in terms of what the consumer's prepared to pay, and we kind of want to build this, but it's always a challenge to kind of keep up with, I suppose, people's expectations and desire to kind of grow. And there's been some proposals for legislation to put a hefty tax on the consumer to kind of pay artists more. So we understand that, and I very much understand the rationale and why people are coming to these kinds of ideas, but it needs to be done very, very carefully so that we don't undermine this growth success story that we've had. So those are kind of some of the key tension points in terms of public policy. As I say, AI right now is a key issue for us to work on, because the services have absolutely no incentive in carrying deceptive content. Drake recordings recently, there was one a year ago called the Fake Drake track, and then there's one much more recently that he released using other artists' voices. These are absolutely key issues that the industry is having to grapple with, and we're all starting to grapple with as to how do we manage this.
Yeah. When you were talking about that, the growth of streaming, I'm just thinking back. And when I was a kid, you'd get a CD or a cassette tape and you just listen to the same thing over and over again because, you didn't have the variety. Yeah. And obviously that has changed so much. And anytime you have change, I mean, you're going to have existing, people don't like change, right? So you're going to have folks that don't love it, but obviously the customer loves it and things are moving in that direction and we have so much more choice. I wonder if you could talk about, when I think from an influence standpoint, and the role that you play in the industry that you've played in the UK and that you're playing now. You have these players who are, might seem at odds with one another on the outside, but you have to figure out how to, get them to see, hey, this is where things are going, so we can compromise and, and move things forward. I wonder if you could just talk about, your approach to that, or I don't know if you have any examples of that. But it seems like this is one of those spaces where you definitely have to get unlikely allies to sometimes collaborate when, maybe they haven't been used to doing that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think, when we talk about influencing, my sort of take on that one is that ultimately it is about communication. And I always remember I did a communication course once, and they were like, some people think communication is just sending stuff out into the ether.
Yeah.
Rather than, is your message being received? Is anyone actually listening to what you have to say? So I think that my experience in the UK on these issues was that there is a need to be clear on what your position is and what you stand for, and why you're advocating for a particular position. And hopefully that is on firm ground, in terms of the fact base and the rationale. But then that absolutely is the start of the process. It's not the end of the process. So I think that, you know, so much of it is to understand, well, where are other people coming from? Why are they coming from those positions? And ultimately, you know, I can't think of anything that doesn't involve some compromise and some middle ground. And, you know, particularly when you're talking about legislation, you know, politics is all about that. But within the industry, you know, try to find common solutions. But sometimes that does, you know, when we're talking about change, that does mean some disruption. So, you know, you don't get change without, you know, some kind of push, as well as, you know, the consensus building and problem solving. So I think that's kind of how I see it. It's a mix of the two. I think you kind of have to have, you know, if you're going to advocate for change, you have to be sort of strong and confident that you have a legitimate sort of reason for advocating for that. And then, but you have to do it by listening and circling back, and, you know, that constant sort of, and that goes internally within organizations, you know, that organizations of large numbers of people through to smaller numbers. It's always the same thing, which I think is kind of, particularly if you're leading an organization, you do have to have a vision and a sense of direction. People need that. Not everyone will be on board with that, or not everyone will understand it, or it will take different times for people to kind of come around. That's the majority of the work, as I see it, is just, you know, understanding that's the job, is to communicate and be open. I think you just got to be open at all times to hearing what people have to say.
Yeah, it's clear that influence is such an important part of what you have to do in your role and what organizations like yours have to do. And I want to talk about kind of influence through collaboration as part of that. You sort of were moving in that direction. DiMA, I know, partnered with Black Music Action Coalition, Music Artists Coalition, and Songwriters of North America on a recent Songwriters Salute during Grammy Week. And I wonder if you could talk about that. And even I was just curious, have streaming companies always had a cozy relationship with songwriters? Because it occurred to me that you know, maybe it wasn't always like that.
Yeah, so I think for me, it was, you know, such a great event, and I'm really pleased that we were able to do it with those three groups. For me, coming from being a songwriter advocate, you know, that was really nice to do it, and for a bit of continuity, but also actually, you know, those groups, Grammys, everyone knows the awards, but Grammy Week is actually a very incredibly vibrant and busy week where people do mixes and events and stuff like that. And those groups I don't think had done an event. So for me, it was also an opportunity to elevate and give some platform for them. There was a lot of Congress people out there that week. So it worked brilliantly well. But to your point, you know, I think that DiMA and its members have always worked as closely as we can. There are points where over periods of times there are, you know, it's closer or it's further apart, or that there's issues. But to me, you know, again, back to that where we started on the interview, which was, what's the function of DiMA? Well, we really want to have open, full dialogue across the industry at all times. That's where, if I can achieve that, I think I'm adding real value for our members, whether there's particular disputes or tension points or policy issues. And there's always a negotiation that goes on in the industry about what's the value of the rights and those kinds of things. But, you know, music streaming doesn't, hopefully you got my earlier message. You know, recordings don't exist without songs.
Right.
And the music streaming doesn't exist without the music. So, but similarly, obviously the songwriters and composers I know value massively the opportunity that music streaming gives to them, not just in terms of the money that it's generating, which is, you know, growing every year and really substantial, but the platform, you know, the access that you have now to fans across the world, you know, is enormous. So it's a, you know, it's a joint thing. But, you know, I'm hoping that we can do events with other groups around the industry, you know, we're open to all. The system only works if everybody is working together. But to your point, for me, you know, if there are differences, if you don't have a relationship, people, you're not going to understand them. It goes back to that sort of influencing through collaboration and dialogue. So, yeah, it was a great event, and hopefully one of many to come.
Yeah, it's such a good example of, I mean, the kind of leadership philosophy that you're sharing about having those open lines of communication, you know, for what you agree on, but also, you know, areas that you may not agree, still have to have that open communication, communicate your vision of where you're going and why, so that, you know, everyone understands the other folks' motives. And then finding those areas of shared success. You've said several times, you know, songs, you know, the streaming wouldn't exist without songwriters and songs. And so that's such an important part of it, and honoring that and doing that through that collaboration. So it's you know, some really good lessons there. I wanted to go back to your time at the Ivers Academy. I know you led a major streaming campaign there. And, you know, a lot of the folks who we know listen to Chief Influencer are thinking about influencing policy and outcomes, but often with a focus on the United States. One of our sponsors is the Graduate School of Political Management at the George Washington University. And so those folks generally are going to be in DC or around the country thinking about how to influence DC. So you worked on some major advocacy campaigns that are focused on the United Kingdom and even global campaigns. And I wonder if you could talk about some of the differences that you've noticed, if there are any, about advocacy campaigns in the UK or globally compared to our environment here in the US.
Yeah, thanks. I think still a little bit soon for me to kind of say that I'm understanding how the advocacy completely works here. But you know, some of the initial observations, I think, which sound a bit obvious, I suppose, but the United States is a much bigger place, and that I see in terms of that there are more groups, there are more voices, there are more parties to connect with and coalesce and coordinate than the UK on first flush. It feels that way. As a case in point, the Ivers Academy is pretty much the only songwriter advocacy organisation there, whereas in the US there's, you know, 2 or 3, just as a case in point. So, and I think similar to that, the federal and the state, you know, approach is very different to the UK. You're pretty much generally, you know, just kind of lobbying in one space in the UK. I think some of the things that are, you know, very similar and actually kind of building on the importance of the states is that I think all effective advocacy, or when I was at the Ivers Academy, we were effective where we had a very strong advocate within Parliament. And so, you know, if you're able to get a member of Congress to, you know, really sort of connect with your cause, that's incredibly important. And you know, sort of seeing how that kind of is important for a particular state, I think sort of magnifies it somewhat more than if you're an MP representing a small constituency in, I don't know, southwest England or something like that. You don't have as much stake, whereas I think that the state system here really sort of applies. This is important for my, you know, people that have elected me. So I think that those common things. The part of the success we had in the UK was having grassroots-led campaigns. So I think that these are, I can see as similar things. I think if you're able to sort of balance, why does this matter? How does it connect? Who wants it? With the, you know, the sort of the economic and the other sort of wider aspects that cuts through. So I think it was probably relatively, you know, it was a bit easier if you come to Parliament with a high profile person. I mean, one of the campaigns that we did was Credits Due, which we did with DiMA. which was to highlight the issue that many songs, many recordings on the streaming platforms are missing any information on who wrote the song. Now, consumers want it. If you're like, oh, this song's great, sounds a bit similar to who wrote it. All right, I want to see what else they wrote. Pretty obvious, and but sadly, lots of that data is absent. So the campaign was to highlight that, and obviously, if the songwriter's not being credited, they're not going to get paid either. So we got Bjorn Ulvaeus from ABBA. I wouldn't say that's grassroots. The opposite of grassroots, at the top of the grass. But he's somebody that is able to kind of really lean in very heavily and support the community. So I think that we were able to kind of run two sides. We sort of had the grassroots element. Look, this is why this is important for people to get paid and to get credited, and then you had Bjorn, who was able to really cut through it and get our message out there on an international basis, which we're planning an event on Credits Due in New York next month. So this campaign continues now to run, so it continues to be successful.
What have you seen since you started doing that? Or I mean, is that resulting in more songwriters getting credits and
Well, back to the while some things move very fast, technology moves very fast, some things move less fast. And music metadata on the publishing side is not the fastest moving. But yes, the campaign's been successful. There's a UK government sponsored program of activity to effect change within 2 years. And they're probably about heading towards a year into that, and what we have seen is that the services are now displaying much more of the songwriter information where it's coming through the supply chain. So there's I could take up a whole podcast on this one and probably bore the audience to tears, but there is a lot going on behind the scenes to try and actually get the information, which you would think should be easy to apply. It's sadly not, but yeah, there's progress being made, but we have to. This is the thing with these kinds of campaigns, you just have to keep these things moving, because otherwise the progress can easily sort of fall away and we don't get the change we need.
Well, it reinforces what you've said today, Graham, because you talk about you have to have that vision that you communicate why you're doing things, and I think there's an element of storytelling in there. Obviously, having Bjorn Ulvaeus kind of helps you get that story out and connect with people.
Yeah.
But at the same time, under the surface, we don't think about as consumers, like, where's the metadata coming from to show up in my app when I click the 3 dots to be able to see the credits for, I mean, that's not the type of thing that most people are thinking about. But there are all these other players engaged, and, they have their systems and their way of doing things. And they might say, yeah, that's fine. It's just that we're not set up to do it, or we don't have the data or whatever. So you're having to help navigate all that.
And I tell you what's interesting, because I think one way that people get it really quickly is when it was vinyl, you'd look on the back of the vinyl and you'd see all the information, right? And that was really important to the discovery process and the fan engagement. But technology changed. Without the supply chain for the physical product had these gates. One of the benefits of new technology is that you can get music up onto streaming really, really quickly now. You can record something, you can bounce it, and people would do stuff from their home studios, and that's a great thing. But sadly, the supply chain of, well, we also need to know who wrote the song and who played the bass, and that information at the moment is not kind of carrying at the same pace, because technology's changed the supply chain as well as the way you engage in music. So yeah, I'm probably another behavioral characteristic for me is forever hopeful, optimistic. Change is possible. It is happening. It may be slow, but it doesn't mean it's not possible.
Love that. I'm thinking of a tie-in from ABBA. The winner takes it all, I think, is the song. So maybe that
exactly.
Sing that when you have your victory. Okay, I want to ask you, as we kind of wrap up today's conversation. We talked a little bit about what you might play on the piano. But I won't ask you what streaming service you use, but what's on your playlist when you open it?
Well, obviously, I'm a big fan of all the streaming services. Yeah, what about, I think at the moment I'm kind of quite fixated on Jacob Collier. I don't know if you're aware of his music. He's a amazing, but one of the things, it's very difficult to talk about genres now, I think, because, particularly playlists mean that you can have a whole variety of different music that's not sort of like, it's a rock playlist or it's a jazz playlist or and he's very much one of these kind of, his latest album is something which is a whole mix of genres. So not just because he's British, but because he's phenomenal. Do check him out.
I will. And it's funny you say that, because now even you'll pull up a playlist and it will be like, songs of a certain genre that are in the style of a different genre, like a cafe background kind of playlist that is songs we recognize, and it just shows how dynamic and fast changing the industry is.
Yeah.
Well, Graham, I really appreciate you taking time to be with us today. I think when we think about such a fast changing industry, whether we're communicators or in politics or leaders in other industries, you shared some great lessons that we can all take with us. We have to have that vision. We have to know where we're going, and we have to clearly communicate that to others, because, that transparency and that clarity is really important. But then at the same time, we have to understand, what's important to all those other stakeholders, and how do we find ways to showcase where we have commonalities so that we can work together where we do, even though we may have differences in other areas. And you talked about, the great recent collaboration you did, the Grammys around that, and the way that you're messaging this when you're testifying in front of Capitol Hill, and of course, the successful campaigns that you ran at the Ivers Academy, working with artists. So my playlist later today, I think I have ABBA in my head now, so I'm gonna I'll be listening to some Dancing Queen. But we welcome you to the United States, and we just want to say congrats on being named a Chief Influencer, and thank you for sharing your story with us today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Chief Influencer, a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board. If you know a leader who should be featured as a Chief Influencer, please nominate them at chiefinfluencer.org. For show notes and more, visit us at chiefinfluencer.org or follow Chief Influencer on LinkedIn. Until next time,